to have more insights, we now have the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS Jakarta, International Relations Head with us.
Welcome, Lina, Alexandra. Certainly glad to have you here. And we're looking forward to hear your perspective on this, because both of us sat here kind of starstruck and just feeling inspired by this current speech that which highlights so much achievements that Indonesian diplomacy has achieved in 2022. But what, according to you, are the most important highlights of this press statement?
Thank you for the question. But I think from the statement itself, I think it's clear in terms of the achievements that Indonesia has made in 2002. Ibu Menlu mentioned about the G20 presidency, which achieved quite a lot of success, despite of a lot of, views that it's not going to be successful this year because of the tensions out of the Russian-Ukraine crisis.
Yeah, she was also mentioning about the pessimism.
Yes, the pessimism. So Indonesia actually managed to go beyond expectations.
I agree.
So definitely that's one point. And the second point she also mentioned in terms of the achievement in Indonesia's health diplomacy, in securing the vaccine supplies, things like that. But of course, in terms of the plans, what we are going to achieve, at least within the next year or so, is she highlighted some of the new items or new components like, for example, the economic diplomacy. I think that receives a lot of emphasis in her statement, and definitely on how Indonesia will pursue its chairmanship in ASEAN, because Indonesia definitely will assume the position as the chair next year, this year in 2023.
Yeah,
and she highlights, of course, a lot of points, the priorities agenda for Indonesia's chairmanship.
And it's very interesting when it comes to Indonesia's chairmanship of ASEAN on 2023. But in your point of view, which objectives are the most feasible for Indonesia this year?
Well, if we start from maybe we can say a low-hanging fruit, is the Timor-Leste membership, because Indonesia has championed that since a long time ago for Timor-Leste to be incorporated into ASEAN family. But of course, the other things that Indonesia might face some challenges is in terms of ASEAN agenda itself, the priorities of strengthening ASEAN capacities and institutions, because that really hit the big point within ASEAN, which we very much hoping that ASEAN can bring back its credibility and relevance, especially in dealing with its own problems internally, like the Myanmar crisis that we are having now. So that's part of how ASEAN can be more credible and resilient. Ibu Menlu mentioned about this point as well, about the ASEAN resilience itself. So this is something I think that might be quite challenging. Other than that is, of course, she emphasized or she underlines also the issue of major power rivalries. And this is something that really put ASEAN into a very difficult situation. She mentions about ASEAN centrality itself, which has always been in the annual statement from year to year. But of course, the point is really, the big question is how Indonesia, in its chairmanship this year, can actually help to bring back ASEAN centrality through Indonesia's leadership.
Well, this is certainly interesting because the Myanmar topic, she spoke a lot about the 5 PCs, right? So that was finalized or agreed upon in the previous presidency, but failed to see any progress of its implementation. Now, in terms of Myanmar, both its internal politics and let's add the Rohingya issue as well, because Indonesia is a country directly affected by that as well. How successful do you think, with its plan that's already been revealed, will Indonesia be as a mediator? She did mention that she looks to open an office of special envoy that is led by the foreign minister herself.
Yeah. I think we all know that there has been a lot, very high expectations on Indonesia this year to really make a breakthrough in terms of ASEAN's role in facilitating the mediation process in Myanmar internal crisis. And definitely, I think compared to the other countries, the other actors, Indonesia has been at the forefront actually in pushing for the implementation of the 5-point consensus. And I think the point that Ibu Menlu mentioned about the Office of Special Envoy is we will need to wait and see how she operationalized this Office of the Special Envoy, because if we see the previous chairs, they only have the Special Envoy, which is the foreign minister themselves, basically. So definitely, I think based on the previous decision on the refuse of the implementation of the 5-point consensus, a lot of points are there actually that Indonesia is seeking to push forward. And one point that she emphasized also in her statement is how she would like to pursue for the engagement of all stakeholders in Myanmar.
Yeah, I also aware of that, and also we heard about her expressing her disappointment on the how the junta military was actually putting on the resolutions on every problems that now have occurred in Myanmar. But do you think that in this case of Myanmar and Indonesia as holding the chairmanship of 2023, do we need any personal touch from either Ibu Menlu or President Joko Widodo, as what we saw in Ukraine and Russia, where President Joko Widodo had visited them in such particular time?
Definitely. I think, I believe from our conversation also, definitely with the Foreign Ministry and Ibu Retno herself, definitely she will take the lead in this effort. And with that, because the ASEAN mechanism itself, now the ASEAN mechanism that is handling Myanmar issue is currently the ASEAN Summit, meaning it's the ASEAN leaders themselves. And in this case, I mean, like, definitely we would like to see a bigger role from our president, based, of course, through the endorsement from the foreign ministry itself, that this is something that put Indonesia's chairmanship into a test. Right? So Indonesia will need to put a lot of efforts. Regarding, although Ibu Menlu mentioned that she doesn't want to make Myanmar crisis to take ASEAN hostage, because Indonesia has other priorities, other agenda to pursue. But we cannot deny the fact that the Myanmar crisis certainly is the litmus test for Indonesia's chairmanship and for ASEAN's credibility itself.
So it's very interesting what you mentioned. It doesn't matter what plans we have to pursue in regards to ASEAN. This one problem can actually still, still affect the image of the association, because at the end of the day, ASEAN itself is an association of different countries. Now, speaking of that, it is a very heavy burden to carry for the next year. And according to you, though, how should Indonesia strategize as its role as a leader in the region, including the ASEAN +3, right, and the bridge for inter-regional forum, and specifically the green economic area, because the way the speech was made and the way the achievements were pointed out in different ways, and the wordings that she chose, the foreign minister, acted as if to give the impression that Indonesia so far in 2022 has done a great job in bridging different opportunities, not just for Indonesia, but also for developing countries.
Well, maybe it's a lot to take from that question. The first question, I think Ibu Menlu mentioned also about the multilateralism, that Indonesia is having a great interest to push for the multilateralism, because we know now the trend is the opposing, actually, the unilateralism trend initiated by the big powers mainly. So with the ASEAN +3, it's definitely something that Indonesia will need to pursue, and particularly we would like to see a little bit bigger than ASEAN +3, but it's something that ASEAN has invented, has pushed previously, is the East Asia Summit. So how to operationalize this Asia Summit? It has been there, but the reality, we just see, okay, these leaders from ASEAN countries plus the dialogue partners from the major countries, they just come, have coffee, have lunch together, and then go back. So we will need to rejuvenate this East Asia Summit, which actually the core itself is ASEAN Plus 3. With the green economy, I think it's something, it's a global trend itself, and Indonesia will definitely need to take part of it. And it's something that Indonesia will pursue as part of its economic diplomacy. So definitely, again, a lot to take for this year, but I think Indonesia can, with the support, of course, from the Indonesian public itself, it's something that Indonesia will be able to achieve.
All right, but I want to take a step back on the discussion. We saw also that the minister divided this statement into four different subjects, like four big subjects. Yeah. One of them being border diplomacy, and she was mentioning about the border diplomacy with Malaysia, with Timor-Leste, with Vietnam, with Palau as well, and in particular with Timor-Leste. We know that this is something that what you're mentioning earlier, that some problems have been solved with Timor-Leste as well, as we know. But also this membership, I mean, for Timor-Leste to be in ASEAN, will it be a good news for Timor-Leste during Indonesia's chairmanship of ASEAN? Will they be the members now?
Well, I believe, again, Indonesia has been pushing for that particular agenda since a long time ago, and this is the momentum for Indonesia. So definitely this is something that Indonesia should be able to realize it for this year.
But we cannot assume yet whether it will be done like this year or...
Well, the last conversation that I heard, it will be a gradual process to some extent. Because the membership itself needs a process by itself, you know. And definitely Timor-Leste will be put as well, I don't know how to say it, but you put Timor-Leste under the observation itself, the observer status, because definitely a lot of capacity building work will need to be done before they can actually assume the full-fledged membership in ASEAN. But definitely it's going there.
I understand there are certain criteria, of course, that every membership countries have to uphold, but I know that when it comes to memberships, it has to be a consensus. So I know if Indonesia has been pushing for this agenda for a while now, it means that there must have been some hindrances, because in order to receive a member, it has to be a full consensus. Are there perhaps any parties who, if you could say, disagree or perhaps think that because of the condition of the country itself, they're currently not yet ready?
Well, of course, we know that there are some countries that are still quite having reservation about Timor-Leste being membership. But I think the last update that I learned, I think it has been settled to some extent. So that's why Indonesia, like the foreign minister, can freely announce that Timor-Leste is going to be a new member of ASEAN to some extent. So to some extent, the debate, the tension, the disagreement has been settled.
Interesting. Yeah. Very interesting.
Now, aside from what we've been discussing, Myanmar, Timor-Leste, ASEAN chairmanship and stuff like that, but also we heard that Ibu Menlu mentioned about Indonesia's commitment to the issues of Afghanistan and also Palestine, and its eagerness to be the non-permanent member of the UNHRC. Now, should Indonesia pursuing this non-permanent membership, should Indonesia put human rights affairs to be in the front row of its foreign policy now?
Well, if I can add, the other one, the last statement from Ibu Menlu, that Indonesia is seeking also to become the non-permanent member of the UN Security Council in 2029, 2030. So definitely it's the indication that Indonesia is actually maybe flexing its muscle to become, to take more the forward position to show that Indonesia is playing a global role, the leadership role, things like that. But if I may give some, maybe like a critical insight to this, it's something that Indonesia has been traditionally done in terms of Palestine, in terms of Afghanistan, you know. So there needs to be something else than this. The UN Security Council membership is something that Indonesia definitely will need to pursue in order to contribute into the shaping of the international or global architecture. You know, because we know the system in the UN with the permanent five, you know, it's never been fair to some extent. And this has been Indonesia's agenda, I don't know, since decades ago, that the membership of the permanent membership of the UN Security Council will need to be revised that reflect the current global architecture with Asian countries, now we call it Asian civilization, you know.
On the rise, that's
yeah,
right.
Yeah, so definitely this needs to reflect the current, the real global architectures that we have.
It's very interesting because there are a lot of very optimistic long-term goals, actually, that was mentioned, as you mentioned before. So there was a sense that while Indonesia seems to be preparing, as you mentioned, flexing its muscles, we heard an interesting statement today from an expert that says foreign policy begins from within the country itself, right?
From home.
From home. And do you think we are ready to go that way? I mean, the goal itself to become a UN Security Council is in 2029 and 2030, so there is still some time. And President Joko Widodo has just recently admitted to a few human rights issues that went down in Indonesia, and that is the start to the UNHCR.
Yeah.
So what do you think is going to happen in this particular year in preparing them or in getting Indonesia ready to flex their muscle internationally that way?
Definitely. Well, if I can recall, one of the Indonesian foreign policy experts a long time ago mentioned that Indonesia's foreign policy is actually interdomestic. It's the nexus between international and domestic issues. And now, as with the advancements of technology, social media, people are now more well-versed with foreign policy issues. And like, for example, the previous visits by President Jokowi to Ukraine and to Moscow, that gained a lot of attention from the Indonesian public. So definitely, I think the support from the Indonesian public is something that is very much needed for the government to really pursue its role at the global level. So I think, judging from that, I think we are ready. But definitely, the foreign ministry will need to, you know, do a lot of work in terms of, you know,
internally publishing what they do as well. But if just a quick follow-up, if G20 hasn't shown the unity of all ministries being able to put together in the different you know, sub-meetings that happen, so many sub-meetings happen in Indonesia, if anything, don't you think that in itself has already shown that all the institutions in Indonesia are ready to support the foreign ministry for the international aspect?
Definitely, and there's always the key issue here in Indonesia: coordination. Yeah. To make everything work.
But, okay, so before we conclude this discussion, it is very interesting to see how the foreign ministry can actually stay true to Indonesians' foreign policy of free and active. But amid the 2 days global rivalry between the US and China, how would you assess the relevance of it?
Well, definitely that becomes very, very relevant. But the problem that we always have is we misunderstand the term free and active. Free is always translated or interpreted as being neutral, meaning just stand in the middle doing nothing. And this is something that we don't want to see, because I think when Vice President Muhammad Hatta launched this idea back in 1948, the idea of the term is not free actually. When we translate it into English, it's independent. Independent doesn't mean that we are staying in the middle and doing nothing and just become a spectator. Being independent meaning that we can make our own standpoint when we respond to international issues, international developments. based on what we want to pursue for our national interests, and also how we can contribute to international peace and security. That comes the linkage with the active term itself, that Indonesia is being active to be able to become a global player to provide public goods for the international community. So definitely when we see the major powers rivalry, that's exactly where Indonesia will have to navigate its way in order how we can bring these major powers into cooperation rather than conflict. That's why the idea of Ibu Menlu mentioned about ASEAN outlook in the Pacific, pursuing multilateralism, ASEAN +3, things like that. These are the venues, these are the platforms that Indonesia will need to push forward through the ASEAN particularly, how to bring these major countries, these big powers, to come together, sit and having dialogue.
But one last question, follow-up. This is the conclusion that everyone wants to hear. In your view as an expert who is observing, foreign policies and foreign diplomacy efforts here done by Indonesia, how do you think Indonesia is doing in terms of keeping the balance and yet, as you mentioned before, not sacrificing our independence to be able to stand strong at certain standpoints?
Well, I think to some extent Indonesia has played the balance quite well. Although, again, there has been always criticism that Indonesia has been punching below its weight. So there is still a lot of potentials that Indonesia will have to project, will have to show in order to be able to show that Indonesia can manage, can play and balance the relations between these major powers. So countries like Indonesia and other developing powers are not stepped in between of these major powers rivalries.
Well, Lina, Alexandra, thank you so much for the insight. It certainly was a very informative discussion.
I really hope that it could be longer. Because it's very fun thing to watch and also to discuss about Indonesia's achievement in terms
This is your first one, right?
This is my first one.
Imagine at home I have to watch this every single year with my father. So thank you very much, Lina, Alexandra, for the insight, Head of International Relations of CSIS Indonesia. And we're going for another break for this hour.
And after the break, Maria will deliver some economics and business updates. Don't go anywhere.